Good afternoon, Anja, and thank you very much for giving up your time to talk to the Mint.
Thank you for having me.
Brilliant. Well, our topic today, obviously, is the Belt and Road Initiative. And I wonder if you could start by explaining a bit about it in sort of broad terms and how it sort of developed.
It started really with the change of power or government in China when Xi Jinping came into power around 2012. And he immediately announced a new, which today we know about the new foreign policy of China and development policy at that time. It's very important to recall that around 2012 and 13, it started with a development strategy inside and outside China, which later turned into the Belt and Road Initiative. And here is one more important point. Where did Xi Jinping announce that Belt and Road Initiative? And that was in the capital of Kazakhstan, a neighboring country of China in Central Asia, in Astana at its capital in 2013. And when presidents or governments or heads of states announce a new strategy and policy, they choose very wisely where they announce it. Of course, people knew about it, that it was coming up, etc. He could have done it in Beijing, but he didn't. He did it in Astana. And he did it in the heart of the Eurasian continent, because from a Chinese perspective, that continent, starting in basically in Hong Kong and ending in Lisbon or in Dublin, what the Chinese and also the Russians call Eurasia, and it's a term and notion that is more known now also in Western Europe. And China works on with the understanding of this in the Eurasian context. And when we look at the Eurasian map, then Astana, Kazakhstan is pretty much in the center. Even so, from a Western European perspective, it's still 6,000 miles away.
Right. Yes, it's quite interesting. We don't, I suppose, Europe tends to think itself as more important than and to be put down as one part of Europe. Eurasia is not immediately sort of positive, is it? So it started with this development perspective. So how did it evolve over time?
It really changed from this development perspective. China now is more seen in the region where they invest most of their $4 trillion project. We should not forget it's an immense sum of investment. Most of these investments, by the way, happen inside China, not outside China. But when we look outside China, most of the investments of this $4 trillion budget actually is in Central Asia and in the peripheries, in the neighboring countries of China. And of course, we often recall the investments China is doing in Africa or in the Middle East, now in South America, etc. But actually, most of the money goes into the Asian, let's say, the Asian corridors, the trade routes, the corridors there, the neighboring states. And there we could see how this original strategy about developing the region and developing the country moved into rather what we understand or mean by modernizing. China has been modernizing the infrastructure in the regions. And this is a significant difference, because whether you develop the region, and development is something that has an idea of sustainable development and where people have sort of also ownership over the infrastructure project, etc. That did not happen. But what indeed happened is China, because also of its technology and its advantages there, they modernize. They modernize railroads, they modernize energy plants, they modernize harbors, etc. And there is a particular focus and a strategy behind it, why China needs modernized and highly, sort of sophisticated and advanced infrastructure projects in the region.
So, and the infrastructure, these transport routes, where are they connecting China to?
Well, China officially announced that it has 6 main corridors as part of these the Belt and Road initiatives. And when we look at these corridors, of course, we know the main one of the main ones, which is the maritime route, you know, going through Africa and also now through the Pacific. And this is usually what we hear about in the news because they are so big and you know, they circle basically the planet. But the corridor that is most important is the land corridor going from China through Central Asia, and that is why Xi Jinping announced it in Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan is the main hub for the main corridor of the Belt and Road Initiative. Kazakhstan through Russia, then through Belarus, Ukraine, and here we come into the topic why China is yet behind the screens, very much involved in the war in Ukraine, or plays a role there, because one of the corridors, these land corridors towards Europe and towards the European Union in particular, goes through Ukraine, Belarus, and certainly, of course, through Russia, but also through the Middle East. But the largest or the most important really is the European one, or the Eurasian one. The European Union and its, let's say, its stable market is the main target, if you want, of the Belt and Road Initiative. Whereas the Belt and Road Initiative in most of these corridors, when they go to Africa or now to South America or Central America, it's about, yes, it's about trade. It is more about, you know, the exploitation of natural resources and of resources in general. Western Europe obviously is not a resource region,
Yeah.
but it is the market for China, and it's a very important market to sell Chinese products.
So the likes of Kyrgyzstan is a sort of just a stopping point on a road. It's maybe a sort of more like creating a sort of a pub or an inn on the way to the main event in Europe.
And we can see this when we travel through Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan. China has, over the last 10 years, built immense sort of dry harbors, railroad tracks, logistical centers. They have built entire airports just for logistics to distribute their products, basically. And from there, from Central Asia, really they spread out across the Eurasian continent. And really, Eurasia is the main target. And then there is a second element, and that is why I'm saying it never really reached the level where we can say China is actually developing the regions or developing the countries. They're investing, they're modernizing, and yes, of course, they create some jobs, but development is something else. Development strategy is something else. And they never made a secret out of it that their main goal is to develop its own country, of course, China, and to maintain, let's say, what we would call peace and stability in China. And for that, China needs the Belt and Road Initiative because they do have economic problems. They do have unemployment in China. And so they need to keep the high level of production and productivity in China up, to keep basically the Chinese happy, to stabilize power and also security. And for that, they need markets. And the market is, again, Europe.
So you could argue this is quite different from, I suppose, yes, the development, empire, colonialism, etc., where, as you say, this was looking for resources and exploiting resources and controlling access to resources, which, as you say, is happening in Africa. But this sounds interestingly different. How do the countries that these big highways are going through and big railways are going to, how do they feel about it? I mean, did they have an impression that they were going to get development, etc., rather than being a sort of throughway for trade?
Well, most of these countries are not democracies. Hence, we do not hear from governmental officials in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, Russia, Ukraine, but you can also say Pakistan, Afghanistan is a main track now. that you will never hear from leaders of these countries otherwise than development. They would always sell the Chinese investments, and Chinese do pay a lot of money to these countries and to these governments, but they would never sell it as less than development. But when you look at the people, and there is a word that I only learned when I moved to Central Asia some years ago, and that is xenophobia. And that was before Corona. After Corona, everybody knew the terminology. But my colleagues in Central Asia, they were openly speaking these sort of anti-Chinese sentiments, which have been dramatically grown over the past decades. And it's because the Chinese did not bring development. They did not bring the jobs. They did not bring the sort of the development in urban infrastructure or urban way of life or quality of life. However, since they became more or less as a modernizer and to explore markets and corridors, China has developed also into another actor, which I'm sometimes not sure whether they really anticipated it in 2013, and that is of a security actor. China and Russia had long-standing deals since the early 2000s about how to divide basically Central Asia. I mean, I'm oversimplifying now, but there are white papers and agreements which are easily accessible between China and Russia. And that is basically Russia deals with the security of its former sort of Soviet and Tsarist empire, which includes Central Asia. And China is there to modernize slash development. And this deal has been broken long before Corona and long before even the war in Ukraine, when in the peripheries of the former Soviet empire, if you want to say, where Russia had a say, they could not longer stand for the security and safety. There are a lot of border conflicts. We have also seen the case of Afghanistan, which is of course more known to the people, where Russia remained completely absent. And we all know what stakes Russia had in Afghanistan for over a century. And so this was the clear signal also for China to say, now, if there is a power gap, a security power gap in the region, we, the Chinese, will step in, and that's what they do. So today, China is not only a modernizer, it's not only an economic power player and power, but it is also a security player. And with that came another sort of strategy, maybe even, and that is why people today call China even a sort of a modern colonizer, because what they do, they invest massively in educating or teaching people in these countries Chinese language, using them as interpreters, as multiplicators in the region. And that was not the case 10 or 15 years ago. But we see now colonial sort of trends and habits basically happening.
So that's interesting. Even though they're not after the resources, they still, I suppose, want their transport routes protected and their trade to keep flowing. And that means that they do that, gets them into a sort of security stroke education stroke controlling the population. Has there been, I mean, what sort of uprisings or tensions have they faced? Has anyone sought to sabotage any of this infrastructure?
Yes, the short answer is absolutely yes. There have been multiple acts of sabotage in the region in Central Asia when it comes to, so let's say, projects of railroads or tunnels or even energy plants, production facilities, agricultural facilities, let's say. And the local communities are often protesting, etc. And until, yeah, let's say again, until Corona, until the pandemic, and then before the war in Ukraine, you could even read in news about these local protests. You hardly hear and read about this any longer. But when you live there, what you see is that a lot of protests that are announced are sort of taken down by the local police. And the Chinese make very clear to the regional governments in Central Asia and beyond that these protests have to stop. And China has also built some sort of when you look at these facilities and sort of where the Chinese invest or build, they look more and more like fortresses. Yeah, they have Chinese is sending their security guards, actually sort of as Chinese soldiers, often Chinese military being located in these countries. Of course, not coming with a Chinese uniform yet, but they are very, very visible in the region. And also in Afghanistan, in Pakistan, you see them, of course, all over Central Asia. You see them also in Russia. You see them in Belarus. And it's not a coincidence that China had its first ever foreign military base in Central Asia, in Tajikistan, close to the Afghan border and corridor to China. So basically where Pakistan, China, Afghanistan, and Tajikistan are meeting in Central Asia, this is where they where they started their military base, and they're expanding in terms of military base. China is often reluctant to officially acknowledge that they have military bases. But when you investigate local news, you can see clearly that these are military strongholds, and they would never allow local authorities or national authorities to enter these bases.
So just going back to your remark about the fact that China is trying to, I suppose, turn populations or certain segments of the populations into Chinese supporters, sort of, how well's that going? I suppose you could argue that the British did create a sort of, in places like India, so forth, a class of people who did identify as British, and obviously a lot of people still come to Britain for education and all this, that sort of soft power, if you like. Is China any good at soft power?
They're remarkably good. It's probably when even in the last 6-7 years, we can really call it sort of mushrooming of Confucius centers, and in even the smallest towns and places in the region. I'm talking about Central Asia, but it starts in the Caucasus, in Central Europe. You find it all over Southeast Asia, of course, but really mushrooming is probably the term here to use. You go one year to a city that you've never heard of before in your life, and you go the next year, and there are 2 Confucius centers. And
What are Confucius centers?
Confucius centers is like the British Council. There are the centers that China is opening, preferably at universities, but sometimes independently. They also open Chinese cultural centers. You find Chinese libraries all over the region, and there you never see a customer in the library. So what it basically is that this is Chinese governmental policy. But and then there's one more element of this soft power that China is playing strongly, and that is scholarships. China has an open strategy, education strategy they call, but it reminds us very much of former European colonizers that had exactly the same policies, that they give scholarships to hundreds, if not thousands, of young people, graduates from high school graduates in the region, to go to China for 1 or 2 years to learn the language. And most often it is titled as studying tourism. Yeah. And after these 2-3 years in China, they are sent back to Afghanistan, sent back to Kazakhstan, to Russia, and to even Turkey. They're very strong there, or to Serbia, to act as interlocutors between Chinese companies and also governmental officials and local authorities. And I always keep saying is, yes, it's not only a few thousands a year across the Eurasian continent, it is tens of thousands of people. And the sheer number of scholarships they give, the sheer number of centers they open to teach Chinese for free often.
Yeah.
You often have to pay for these courses.
So, how does this play out in the politics and the governments of these countries?
Many people, particularly the ones who are the beneficiary of what we would call soft diplomacy or soft politics in a way, the scholarships, the free education, because with this free education to study the Chinese language often comes a job offer, a direct job offer. So it is, you would maybe even call it development in a way, because this can maintain these young families in the regions, outside China. But I think what helps us, or what helps me often understanding why China is investing in some parts but not in others, and certainly not in democracy and the rule of law, but in sort of stabilizing autocracies, we have to understand what is the main purpose of the Belt and Road Initiative. Whether it's the security strategy, the modernization strategy, the trade strategy, whatever you want to call it, there is one purpose, and that is to keep the stability and power inside China. And whatever serves it is, is good enough. They will just do it. And China always highlighted it. They don't want a world domination, even if we interpreted it in a very different way. And I sometimes ask myself that whether by these policies they issues and what they actually do, the politics they do, whether they really believe that they are not wanting to control parts, at least of the corridors and the trade routes, or whether this is just sheer propaganda. Because with this and this, I think the quality really shifted when they started or needed to securitize their infrastructure projects, their trade routes, etc. Maybe they didn't anticipate it 20 years ago, certainly not 10 years ago, when they thought, okay, we invest, we modernize, we call it development, and since we are investing in sort of autocratic countries with which we have an agreement, they will take care of the security of the railroads, of the power plants, of the projects. And we will therefore pay our due, and that's the deal. And this has changed because now they have to securitize their own Belt and Road Initiative projects.
This seems for me to have some echoes of how the empires, the European empires, grew, isn't it, to some extent? Because I mean, they started around trade and getting hold of resources, but as that becomes more difficult, or the natives rebel, as so forth, then it inevitably sort of leads to security and then control of governments, etc., etc. Is that a path, do you think, that is effectively being followed?
I think so. I think unless there are internal politics in China that change dramatically, I think they are already on the path, which we don't know what historians will call this area or this period in 20, 30 years. But it certainly has sort of tendencies to be called, a period of colonization or colonizing de facto. And I often recall also the European history, our own history, and when European sort of empire started to expand and colonize, as you were saying, they also didn't call it colonization, at the beginning.
Yeah.
But of course, and they also had the same purpose. It is to stabilize the heart of the empire, whether it was the United Kingdom, Great Britain, or France, or Germany, or Spain, for that matter. All the gold from South America went, of course, to the Spain mainland. So it had the same purpose, it had the same strategy, and we see it has sort of the same elements, phenomena that we see. Plus, they educate a local elite in these countries, in this case, to learn Chinese, to understand the Chinese culture and administration, to serve as liaison interlocutor people.
So now things in China are not looking quite so good, are they? The golden days economically seem to be coming to an end, or at least with the crash of the housing boom and now their huge push to export, but the potential trade conflicts with the US and possibly Europe as well. How do you think that's going to affect the dynamics of the Belt and Road Initiative?
Can only speculate, of course, but again, maybe learning from past empires, whether it was the Russian Empire or the British or the French or the Germans or the Austrian, Hungarian, they all collapsed at some stage, and usually when they had too much on their plate. Maybe that is why I was highlighting. I think this sort of seeing China as a security actor, as a security a player in the region, we for a long time underestimated, and I think China was underestimating it too, because they always said, look, yes, we're building our military and we have to stand up against our enemies, but it's just to protect our country. We are not an aggressor.
Yeah.
And maybe they are drawn into something and in the region, because they have been very actively involved in the what we would call the low intensive wars in Myanmar, in Burma, in Myanmar overall, in Central Asia between Tajikistan and Kyrgyzstan, certainly in Afghanistan. So they're having many fronts. The ones that we hear often in Europe is, of course, the issue of Taiwan and the South China Sea, etc., for the obvious reasons. I'm not going into that. But what we look less into, it's really the very close periphery to China in Central Asia on the Eurasian continent. And they have military presence in all these countries, and they support military in these countries too, in accordance with their local government. Again, Myanmar is probably the most obvious case, but also Tajikistan, Afghanistan,
And
and
I
Russia.
suppose, as you say, the fundamental objective is stability in China, and they will do anything to achieve it. So if their current economic circumstances are causing instability because people are losing their jobs or and so on, they will take any, it seems, they will take any steps that they possibly can to counter that. Though I'm not quite sure what their options are. I suppose if Europe shuts down access to some extent, or the US, where do they go? Who else can they sell their stuff to?
I've I had the sort of the privilege to also work and live in China for some time. This was long before the Belt and Road Initiative started, but it was the years of the 2000s, and when there was also more liberty and freedom in China than today. And I learned a great deal at that time from my Chinese colleagues, because they insisted and trying to tell me as a European, trying to understand China, and they always were saying, look, in all Chinese history, the last 2,000 years or 3,000, whatever you want to call it, how long it exists, the Chinese emperors, czars, or leaders, they were always afraid of what they would call the peasants, the people, so domestically. And when we look in the even in the recent history, the last 200-300 years of China, it was always the uprisals from below, from the people of China, that overthrew the governments. It was never really external powers. And so, and this is where I can see now, sometimes now, parallels to the Chinese history. China always, when it was became weak, it started closing down, and we have seen this particularly in what we again would call the soft policies, education policies, for instance, canceling English in the state curriculum, stopping the scholarship or ending scholarship or sending students abroad, etc. Not only because the Chinese are, are short in money or anything, but they don't want the Western influence to take over. We know, of course, about the censorship of the online networks, etc. But now they changed the school curriculum, etc., etc. And these are all indicators of closing down a society. And we will probably notice it here in Europe in the future, that they will start selling some. China will sell some of the projects that they have acquired, whether it's harbors or airports, etc. We've already seen this, for instance, here in Germany, where they were buying airports and then selling them again. And so they will start setting priorities. Again, having one priority, stability in China and whatever serves it. European Union, particularly the European Union, but in Europe even at large, is one of the main markets that China needs to survive. So they will not withdraw from Europe, but they will start setting certain priorities and where to invest.
Well, this has been absolutely fascinating, Anja. Thank you very much. And thank you for speculating about the future, which is always a challenging thing, isn't it? But it has been fascinating, and I've learned a huge amount. And I look forward to keeping in touch and maybe seeing whether your speculations come to fruition.
Yes, I will see too. Thank you very much.
Thank you.